A country in mourning, a city in sorrow. Paris is coming to terms this weekend, once again, with the tragedy of terror. More than 120 people dead, scores wounded, after a string of coordinated attacks that the group known as Islamic State says it carried out. France has declared a state of emergency and 3 days of national mourning. The attackers struck restaurants, bars, a major football match, and a shopping center. The highest death toll was at a concert venue packed with young people. The attackers gunned more than 80 of them down. 3 of the terrorists then blew themselves up. Welcome to this special edition of DW News, looking at the events that took place in the French capital on Friday night. I'm Brent Goff. It's good to have you with us. Some people are saying that these events represent a new chapter in the terror strategy of the group known as Islamic State. The attacks struck at French culture, at the French way of life, at the values of fraternité, liberté, and égalité. Values that France says it will never abandon. We begin our show with a look at how the attacks unfolded.
Mourning those killed in Paris. This bar was one of 6 sites attacked in the city. At least 12 were shot dead here and at a nearby restaurant. Right now I'm shocked and upset. I come often to this bar. I live just next door and heard everything that happened. Paris, the day after the attacks. The streets largely empty. Universities, schools, and tourist attractions are closed. The government advised people to stay in their homes. It gives me goosebumps. Everyone is scared. Tears come to my eyes thinking about it. It's barbaric, and there are no other words. The government is stepping up security measures after declaring a state of emergency. I've notified all of the prefects in writing that they can introduce a curfew in their administrative regions. Officials want residents not to have to fear for their lives. This telephone saved one man's life. He was struck by shrapnel flying near the stadium that was targeted on Friday. The cell phone took the whole impact. If it hadn't, my head would have been blown to bits. The Bataclan concert hall saw the most deadly attack. Multiple gunmen struck a rock concert there, opening fire and taking hostages. Police stormed the building several hours later. By then, more than 80 people were dead. 3 of the attackers blew themselves up, and a 4th was shot dead. Witnesses describe a bloodbath. We heard what we thought were firecrackers. We turned around, and then I saw 2 young men, no older than 25, with Kalashnikovs. They told us to lie down. There was one who kept gesturing for us to get down. The whole room laid down. I was completely under other people, and the attackers kept shooting. French President François Hollande condemned the attack and vowed retaliation.
C'est un acte de guerre.
What happened yesterday is an act of war, and that demands that our country take appropriate action. This act of war targeting France was carried out by the Islamic State militants.
Une armée terroriste, Daesh, une armée djihadiste contre la France.
Attention has turned to Brussels. Police raided a neighborhood there and say they've arrested several suspects in connection with the Paris attacks.
Well, for the French president, François Hollande, these are trying times. This is the 2nd time this year that Paris has been targeted by a major act of terrorism. In January, Islamist gunmen killed 17 people in attacks on a kosher supermarket and the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. After those attacks, Hollande promised resolve. 10 months later, the message remains unchanged.
My dear compatriots, what happened last night in Paris and in Saint-Denis by the Stade de France is an act of war. And when facing a war, the country must take the appropriate decisions. It is an act of war undertaken by a terrorist army, Daesh, a jihadist army against France, against the values that we are defending throughout the world, against what we are, a free country that speaks to the entire planet. It was an act of war that was prepared, organized and planned from abroad. It is an act of absolute barbarism. As of now, 127 people have died, and numerous others are injured. Families are experiencing deep sadness and distress. The country is in pain, and I have signed a decree to declare 3 days of national mourning. France, because it was attacked cowardly, shamelessly and violently, France will be merciless against the barbarians of Daesh. It will act with all the means within the law, with all the means necessary, and on all fronts, interior and exterior, in coordination with our allies who themselves are targeted by this threat. France is strong, and even if it can get hurt, it always stands back up again, and nothing will be able to hit it, even though grief is all around us. France is solid, it is active, France is brave, and it will triumph over barbarism.
That was the French President, Francois Hollande, there speaking. We want to pull in our correspondent, Max Hoffman, who is in Paris, in France, covering this tragedy. You know, Max, when I listen to the French President, you can't help but getting the sense of deja vu. We've heard him say these things before this year. And then we turn to you, and there you are standing on the streets of Paris. How many times have you and I done what we're doing right now and talked about a violent act of terrorism, and especially this year, you being in Paris? I mean, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, unfortunately, we've done it way too often, Brent. Although I enjoy talking to you, but that's a different story. The thing is, Charlie Hebdo took place really just a couple of blocks away from here. So it's basically the same neighborhood. You basically have the same people, the same process. You know how this is going. There's a certain routine to it. And that's horrible, of course, when you're talking about an event like that. But let me just give you an impression how we work here as journalists. If we just turn the camera over there, you see. So we go as far as we can without bugging the police, because of course they have to do their job as well. They have their barriers in place. So you try to find your little place here, and this is actually always a pretty good place to get the information you need, because you can talk to the police officials, you can talk to experts who are usually around here as well. You also talk to other journalists, but you have to always keep something in mind as the guy in front of the camera. The thing is that with a scenario like this, and Charlie Hebdo was very similar to that, you are extremely reliant on information gathering. So the real important people here, the really important journalists, are those that are working behind the scenes. They're trying to get an overlook of what's happening in the different places. And even the authorities don't know exactly what happened. So what we have to do here is to make sure that we only sell the information that has been confirmed, where we feel comfortable with it. And that's very difficult, especially in these times of social media.
Yeah, and you sense, of course, the responsibility that we have to get the story right, because if we get it wrong, the consequences, the reactions could, in this case, be violent. You've been talking to people on the streets there in Paris. Are they showing resilience? Are they willing to continue, taking the high road in dealing with this, or have you seen uglier, more violent strains appearing now that this tragedy has occurred?
There have been some incidents of violence throughout France, but not in Paris, as far as we know. The people are showing the same resilience. Like after Charlie Hebdo, they're saying, of course we're scared, of course this is horrible, but we're not going to be scared all our life. We need to live our lives. We talk to a lot of people who work around here, and they're basically all saying the same thing. I don't want to dig into cliches here, but if there's a French trait to all this, it's the more they get hit, the more often they stand up. That's a very sympathetic French trait of character. And back then, and you remember that too, Brent, we had 3 million people on the streets of Paris a couple of days after Charlie Hebdo happened to show that they were willing to go there for their values. And I think something similar is going to happen.
Back then when we had those millions of people on the street, they were following the French president, Francois Hollande, and he made promises to them that something like Charlie Hebdo would not happen again. And he has not been able to keep that promise. Where does he stand tonight? How damaged is he?
He's damaged for a whole lot of reasons, principally because he couldn't keep his promises, economic promises. France is not better off. But usually what you have after something like this happens, the people rally around their president or their head of state. That's what happened for 9/11 back in the United States. They all rallied behind George W. Bush, and that's what happened to an extent here in France as well after Charlie Hebdo. But when things like that happen twice, and it's rare that we actually get the occasion to see what happens then, things are different because, obviously the credibility of the government isn't as good anymore if it happens the second time, and it's even worse than the first time. To be fair, though, the problems that Francois Hollande is facing here, especially when it comes to terrorism, he didn't make them, most of them, because, of course, you have the aerial strikes in Syria, and some people say, including the attackers, apparently, that that's the reason why this happened, but that's not the reason for the homegrown terrorism you have here. That's the ghettos you have on the outskirts of the big cities where young people, especially from the Maghreb, from Algeria, but now also from the Middle East, don't really have a chance to make something of their life. They don't have opportunity. They don't get an education, at least nothing to mention. They don't get jobs, and that's why they're easy prey for radicalization. That's, by the way, also the same thing up in the neighborhood of Molenbeek in Brussels. We were talking about that. That's why many terrorist schemes are schemed there.
Yeah.
And it's always the same thing. People that are happy, that have a job and family and kids, usually aren't the terrorists who blow up a whole lot of people.
That's right. Yeah, it's always the case, it seems, with that. What about French foreign policy, European foreign policy moving forward here? What do people think? I mean, we heard the French president say that it was an act of war against France. People, today, even the taxi driver asked me, did he think this is going to be the event that's actually going to bring us into war, another war in the Middle East with troops on the ground? What are you hearing there? What do the people in Paris, do they want military action?
They've always been in favor of military action in Syria as long as it's against the Islamic State. Of course, as we know, the situation in Syria is extremely complicated, and you can't just say, okay, this is the Islamic State and this won't help Assad. Or I don't want to get into the details, but that was always what they said. But if that was possible, the people I talked to, a majority of them were always in favor of aerial strikes in Syria. They have a more muscular approach to that whole thing than, for example, the Germans. And you could figure that normally partners and allies would rally around as well after a situation like that. But some of them have learned their lessons. Again, 9/11 is the big blueprint. You can't compare them on many scales, but on some scales you can compare these terrorist attacks. And back then, for the first time, you had invocation of Article 5 of NATO, so that was Afghanistan. We all know that didn't go too well. So I think partners have gotten more careful, but still there will be some kind of response.
We know that there are, 3 days of national mourning scheduled now. Are there specific plans for vigils? I mean, what's that going to look like? What do we know?
We don't know a whole lot of details about that yet. We know that the schools are going to open, so that's normal. Or you could say it's unusual in a situation like that. Maybe just want to show we're going to proceed with daily life. There will be a minute of silence all across France on Monday. There will definitely be more things throughout the week and probably a big demonstration or something like that. Something unusual, though, that's going to happen on Monday is a joint parliamentary presidential session in Versailles. So that will be highly symbolic. Usually the president doesn't visit the French parliament. That's only for very select occasions, and that shows you how serious they are about this symbol.
True. That's a very good point. Max, we're going to have to wrap it up. Again, you're burning the midnight oil, my friend. And if people, as they watch the shows, they know that we've done lots of late live shots like that. Yeah, right. We've got a couple of hours, but, you're a night owl, right? So the later it gets, the better the reporting gets. And you're in Paris. That's a great city if you want to be a night owl. Max, thank you very much. It's good talking with you. Well, the Paris attacks have sent shockwaves around the world. Leaders from China to Saudi Arabia have been quick to condemn the assault and offer their support to France. One of the loudest voices amidst the pledges of solidarity came from the German Chancellor.
Behind us lies one of the most terrible nights that Europe has experienced in a long time. The people of Paris have lived through a nightmare of violence, terror and fear. There's one thing above all I'd like to say to Parisians and all French people. One thing. We, your German friends, are with you. We cry with you. And together we'll lead the fight against those who did these unspeakable things to you.
France is our oldest ally. The French people have stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States time and again. And we want to be very clear that we stand together with them in the fight against terrorism and extremism. Paris itself represents the timeless values of human progress. Those who think that they can terrorize the people of France or the values that they stand for are wrong.
India stands firmly with the great people of France in dealing with this tragedy. And we must stand. We must stand together at humanity in combating the major global threat of our times.
Today, the British and French people stand together as we have so often before in our history when confronted by evil. Shocked but resolute, in sorrow but unbowed.
It's shocking that so many people died in the cruel terrorist attacks in Paris. I share their sadness.
We understand very well the pain that is being felt in France right now. I would like to reiterate that I share the same pain felt by my counterpart François Hollande and all of the French people. I once again extend my condolences to our French friends. Today, we all are French, since we are all together in this fight that we are going to win. They can hurt us as they did yesterday, but they will never defeat us. They will never force us to renounce our liberty, our rights, and our way of life.
That was the Spanish Prime Minister there, along with other world leaders, promising solidarity to the French people. Well, as we mentioned earlier, this is, of course, not the first time this year that France has been targeted by terrorists. There have been a number of incidents in the country in the last 12 months. The most dramatic was the attack on the magazine Charlie Hebdo back in January. Here's more.
Paris, January 7th. 2 gunmen stormed the offices of satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, killing 12. Among them, the magazine's editor, Stéphane Charbonnier, and cartoonist Jean Cabu. The attackers escape, but 2 days later they're killed in a shootout with police 35 kilometers outside the capital. January 9th, a gunman takes over a kosher supermarket, killing 4 after taking hostages. Police stormed the supermarket, killing the attacker. The rest of the hostages are freed. Then, on the 26th of June, a lone attacker near the southern city of Lyon kills his boss at the company where they both worked. He drives to a gas factory and rams gas canisters, causing an explosion. Police are later able to overpower the man. Arras, August 21st. A gunman attacks a passenger on a high-speed train traveling from Amsterdam to Paris. A group of Americans, including one off-duty US soldier, are able to subdue the gunman. Since then, French security services have been on high alert.
I want to pull in Michel Luders. He is a security expert. He is a familiar face here at DW News. Mr. Luders, thanks for taking the time. You've been with us all day. We appreciate it. I have to ask you, though, when we look at the past 10 months, 12 months in France, would you say that French security, French intelligence officials, officers, have they dropped the ball? Have they failed?
Well, it's difficult to understand, let's put it that way, that obviously some of these attackers were known to police, but there had been no reactions, no attempts to arrest them. However, it's too early to, criticize other people. It's also difficult to know what people plan ahead of time. We cannot really know that. Maybe these attackers, supposedly 3 groups of attackers, they were very smart in coordinating this attack without using any technical tools. So it's very hard to find that out.
And are we expecting, when we talk about security, are we expecting these intelligence agencies to predict behavior? Almost, a type of pre-crime division, if you will, to see into the future. Aren't we just asking them to do the impossible?
Well, there has already been an excellent Hollywood movie on that matter, and I think it's not feasible, thanks God. So we will have to live with this security risk. Let's be frank. Terrorism has reached Europe for good. In the past, we used to learn about terror attacks in Beirut and Baghdad or elsewhere in the Arab world. Now we are being hit in Europe. It's the first time that suicide attackers are responsible for such a huge blast in a European capital. So that's really a bad omen for the future.
Yeah, a bad omen for the future, particularly when you consider that one of the attackers was a French national, right? And they found a Syrian passport. So this is international. I mean, we could say that, and again, I'm guessing here, but we could say that these 3 groups were comprised of homegrown and foreign terrorists, right? So,
absolutely.
So how can intelligence and security officials, how do they combat that?
Very difficult, very difficult. And I'm afraid to say that they can't really create an overall security. It's impossible. We, as citizens, we do hope that the state will be able, the security agencies will be able to thwart attempts of this kind. But this appears to be impossible. If you have a group of young men disenchanted, willing to kill themselves, to blow others up with them, what can you do against that? They have a belt carrying around their belly, they have machine guns. Anybody can do that and walk into a public, sphere and kill other people. There is no guarantee against that.
I mean, we hear all the time that there is this generation, particularly in France, of young Muslim men who are disenfranchised, who feel like they have no belonging to society, that they're not vested in society's future. Are they lost? I mean, are they the ones that we are going to, in perpetuity, have to worry about pulling a bomb and blowing us up at some point?
Well, I mean, let's not hope for the worst, but I mean, there is a strong potential of actions of this kind happening again. I mean, we are talking about a country, France, that has seen several terrorist attacks this year. One of the reasons is definitely the fact that we have so many disenfranchised young men from the Arab world who live in these infamous banlieues. When you are born into those suburbs, there is really almost no possibility to get yourself out of this bad fortune, so to speak. On the other hand, France is also very much engaged in the war in the Middle East, so it appears to be an attractive target, although, according to this logic, Britain should also be a good target, but so far Britain has been spared. And I think this has to do with the very different setup of immigration in Great Britain. We don't have this large number of disenfranchised young North Africans.
And just briefly, we are running out of time, but we don't have that situation at all here in Germany. Germany seems to have been spared all of this.
That is true, that is true. I mean, still, we have to be aware of the fact that one day a bomb will blow up in Germany as well. I mean, there is no doubt about that, but the situation is far worse in France.
Michel Luders, as always, thank you for coming in and sharing your insights. Very valuable, as always. Thank you. Well, the terrorist attacks in Paris began while the French and German national football teams were playing a friendly attended by President Francois Hollande. Explosions could be heard at the Stade de France. Now, after the match, security concerns caused the German team to remain in the stadium. Well, on Saturday morning, they took a charter flight back to Frankfurt.
Saturday at 10 a.m., an emotional trip comes to an end. The Germany players arrive at Frankfurt Airport, still affected by the events of the night.
Of course, it was very wrenching, and we were shocked and disturbed. You could see it. The players were very anxious. The information we were getting wasn't always so clear, and we wanted to avoid all risks. And so we decided not to drive through Paris, not to go to a hotel that perhaps couldn't be kept 100% safe. And that's why we decided to stay in the dressing room.
What they'll remember are the fans who poured out onto the pitch after the match because of safety concerns, shocked by the news just as the players were. In the changing room, Lukas Podolski tweeted, "Pray for Paris." Other players posted similar messages. Interim German FA President Reinhard Raubal had high praise for both teams.
I want to point out that the French team said they wouldn't leave as long as the Germans were still there inside. That was an outstanding display of collegiality and camaraderie from the French side.
A decision is expected on Sunday as to whether Germany and the Netherlands will go ahead with their friendly match in Hanover on Tuesday.
Well, we're going to take a short break. We're going to come back in a couple of minutes with the very latest on this story. But before we go, let me recap the main developments for you. France is in mourning tonight as the country comes to terms with the terrorist attacks that have left more than 120 people dead. Suspected Islamists hit at least 6 separate locations across the French capital Friday evening. They struck a restaurant, a concert hall, a shopping mall, and a soccer stadium. It's believed all the assailants are dead. 7 out of 8 of them are thought to have blown themselves up. In an address to the nation, French President Francois Hollande said the attacks were an act of war by Islamic State militants. He said France would be merciless in its response and that the country would remain brave and strong and triumph over barbarism. I'm Brent Goff. Thanks for the company. Thanks for joining us here on DW News. We're going to leave you now with some of the images of solidarity from around the world of people attending vigils, laying flowers, and of public buildings awash tonight in the red, white, and blue, the tricolore of the French flag. Have a good night, everybody.